on a monthly basis just to see how everybody's doing. You like that, Representative Abdul Salam? Okay. It's noted. Thank you. I see one judge with us today. Judge Boyette slipped in back there. Glad to have you with us from Dalton, a friend for a long time. Any other judges that I may have overlooked? Yes, who I met last week or a couple of weeks ago for the first time. Thank you for being with us, too. Even though we probably will not meet again, one housekeeping matter, we will have our committee photograph. What day do we ever do? Tomorrow. Okay, tomorrow. We're going to do that up on off the chamber. So the hardest job I will have this session is to identify a time at which all of you will be on the floor so I can call you off. I'm looking at you, Representative Randall. Are you really? Okay. You going to be here Wednesday? Is Wednesday work just as well? All right, okay, let's do it Wednesday then. I want you in it. Is anybody going to be out Wednesday? All right, hearing no objections, it'll be sometime Wednesday. Okay, today we have with us, or have before us, Senate Bill 413. The sponsor is Senator Johnson, the President Pro Tem of the Senate. The Senate is still in session. I went up and met with Senator Johnson, and he's, I think, had made prior arrangements with Floor Leader Cole to handle this bill, and so we're pleased to have you with us. And he's here as the presenter and a member of the committee, Representative Mangum, and in no other and in no other capacity. All right, Representative Cole, we're pleased to have you present the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Bring before you Senate Bill 413, which is a housekeeping bill that the Secretary of State has brought forward for the Georgia Athletic and Entertainment Commission. Under current law, boxing, mixed martial arts, and professional wrestling are regulated by the GAEC. However, the language is vague, ambiguous, and confusing. For example, it treats the sport of mixed martial arts the same as professional wrestling, even though wrestling is choreographed. The current bill recognizes the similarity in boxing and mixed martial arts while treating professional wrestling separately. What this bill will do is pretty simple. It will help the sports of boxing, mixed martial arts, and professional wrestling in the state while fulfilling the Commission's main responsibility, which is protecting the health, welfare, and safety of the participants and fans. This is a very lengthy bill, and I have here to my left Rob Sims from Secretary of State, and we also have Kelly Farr, who was with the Athletic Association Commission, that will be happy to assist me in any way of answering any questions. And Rob Sims does have a kind of a brief synopsis of how this bill was brought forward, if you might indulge him to give that to you.
Happy to do that, and just so that we're clear. Oh, okay. We're working off LC 293452 ERS. Is that correct, Representative Cole?
That is correct.
And for the benefit of the committee, there have been a lot of discussions between the Secretary of State's office and others over the last week or two, trying to resolve a few little wrinkles, and this bill, I think, is largely a product of those discussions. Is that accurate, Mr. Sims?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. I recognize Mr. Sims from the Secretary of State's office, and we're pleased to have you with us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, I will briefly try and kind of give some background and an overview of basically how this legislation came to where it is today and the reasons for it. As Representative Cole suggested, the current language and the current law, I should say, basically it was evolved from or passed in 2005, and the way it is written, it treats wrestling, mixed martial arts, and boxing all in a cobbled together way, not really making distinctions between the sport of boxing and MMA, and what could be called choreographed professional wrestling. So what we've tried to do over these past several weeks, and this legislation really is the culmination of hours and hours of meetings and drafts and redrafts and trying to talk to all the interested parties and stakeholders in these areas, is come up with a bill that will change the existing law to recognize the distinctions between wrestling, MMA, and boxing, and put some parameters in place as to what the GEAC, which is also commonly referred to the Boxing Commission, can and can't do in the way of promulgating rules and procedures and things of that nature, especially as it pertains to licensure and regulation. As a little bit of a background, as y'all are probably aware, the Boxing Commission has been around for several years, and quite frankly, it really didn't do much in the way of oversight, let alone keeping records, the books, and things of that nature. In 2006, 7, and going into 2008, the state of Georgia will in some form or another have upwards of 300 professional events of some kind or another involving wrestling and MMA and boxing. The problem that we have right now with the existing law is that there aren't even really any provisions in place to require that promoters of these events let the state know what's happening in the way of the events themselves, who is competing, the safety provisions that they may or may not have in place. So you'll see in different areas of the bill that there are some report requirements for pre-match and pre-event reports, as well as post-report requirements. There are also some important safety measures and requirements in there as well, dealing with blood tests, for example, and the documentation that the performers and the fighters themselves have had physicals within a calendar year of the events and things of that nature. Part of the reason for this bill having come to pass here today, or hopefully pass, I should say, is that this past fall, the Boxing Commission passed or posted and was considering many rules dealing with professional wrestling that provoked kind of an outcry and some real pushback from what I'll call the industry, from the performers, the promoters, and the interested parties. We asked the Commission to hold back on passing any rules dealing with these areas, with the hope that we could pass some legislation that would put some parameters in place that would protect the health and the safety of the performers and the public, but also put some kind of restrictions on what the Commission itself could and couldn't do, and that is also reflected in the bill. And I think it'd be safe to say that should legislation not pass this week, that the Boxing Commission will revisit many of these rules in subsequent meetings. They're going to take action of some kind in dealing with the areas of wrestling and MMA in particular. So it's either going to be under the existing code, which is vague and ambiguous, or it's going to be under legislation contained in this bill or similar legislation that would put some parameters on what they can and can't do. A couple of things I want to mention. This past week there was some news about some mixed martial arts events being promoted in the state of Missouri involving minors, some as young as 6 years old. Under the existing law, Georgia would have no jurisdiction over maintaining or regulating those events, or no specific jurisdiction on those events. We've also had a fighter, an amateur boxer, who recently passed away immediately following his fight here in Atlanta in the Golden Gloves tournament, which it's debatable whether or not the existing law would have the provisions in place to allow for medical checks and things of that nature, let alone to have an EMT present at the event to provide emergency health care in the event of an accident or somebody's life became in danger. With that, I'll leave it. I'll leave it to the committee and answer any questions that might be proffered my way. As Representative Cole said, Kelly Farr, who is actually the executive director of the Boxing Commissioner, is here. And one last final thought. I just want to say for the record that the enemy of the good is not the perfect. And I want to express my appreciation to a lot of the organizations that are here today on the wrestling and the MMA side who've come forward to work together on this legislation. It's not been easy. Everyone's got divergent interests, divergent needs within their industries and professions, and this really has been the culmination of a heck of a lot of work, both on the Senate side and committee and in meetings individually. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Sims. We have one that had signed up to speak. Let me stop before we do that, though. Are there any questions of either the presenter or Mr. Sims? Let's see. Is that Representative Benfield? Is that you?
I know I'm throwing you off.
You are.
I'm in beard and seed, I believe.
You're asking questions that will never have been asked from that mic before.
I'm not going to ask about guns, I promise. Okay, my first question, and I'm sure I'll have more as I kind of look through the bill, but on page 2, just looking at the definition of boxing on line 17, the former definition was fairly substantial, and it's been changed to just compete with fists. Can you elaborate a little further on why all the other language has been deleted there?
If you look and continue to look at through some of the other definitions, there are further definitions to cover kickboxing and mixed martial arts, which usually boxing is confined by rule to the fists. Mixed martial arts and kickboxing can involve the fists as well as striking with the legs, the feet, forearms even in some cases, and things of that nature. So in working with Legislative Counsel, we felt that doing the definitions here, it was just simplest to say boxing means to compete with fists.
Okay. And then I want to follow up on the statement you made about was it the wrestler who died? The boxer yes. Who died? Are you saying that we need legislation to allow a physician to render emergency aid at a boxing event?
No,
I didn't understand.
Not necessarily, Representative Benfield. One of the things that's been a concern, I think, of the Boxing Commission, and I can't speak totally for them, but in part of these discussions is there has been some question as to whether or not rules could be promulgated to require EMT personnel to be present at these events. And that's been debated both within the commission as well as representatives of the Attorney General's office and things of that nature. With the boxer who passed away with the Golden Gloves fight, there was a ringside doctor present who attended to the individual as soon as the fight was over. He was not able to continue the fight. It seemed very tired and exhausted and could not continue. The individual left the ring and collapsed ringside. There were no, as we understand it, there were no EMTs present. The ringside doctor tried to administer to him and resuscitate him, but they were also dependent on the 911 call to be responded to before the EMTs would be present to help or resuscitate or whatever it may be. One of the things for these areas, as well as with MMA, is the way this bill is drafted is the Boxing Commission itself could promulgate a rule in the area of boxing and MMA to say an EMT may need to be present. You'll see in other parts of the legislation that there is a requirement that an appointed doctor by the state be present at these events as well, and in some cases that does not exist today either. So it's things of that nature that I was alluding to, and I apologize if that was confusing.
So this allows for rules that would allow
yes,
for an EMT?
And things of that nature.
Okay. Thank you.
Representative Abdul Salam.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess this question would also be to Mr. Sims. In looking through the definitions, is the intent of this legislation to cover such things as the ultimate fighting challenges and things like that? And if so, which section would that fall under?
Yes, ma'am. That is what's referred to as mixed martial arts.
The MMA? Okay.
And that would deal with the ultimate fighting. And the definition, there is a definition for what mixed martial arts is, with the kicking and the striking. Further into the bill, you will see some provisions in the bill that prohibit other types of activities which have been historically referred to as your tough man competitions.
I saw that.
Your bare knuckles fighting. There's a popular internet sensation, if you will, called felony fights that would be outlawed in the state of Georgia under this bill. So I don't have. If you look at, I was going to say,
I'm looking at
section
page 7.
Right. Yes, ma'am.
I'm looking at page 7, but I guess from reading it, it didn't strike me as any of those definitions would cover, unless there's a better way of defining it, I guess, from what I know about the ultimate fighting, which is not very much. It doesn't really seem to fit into any of these categories. I mean, there's basically no skills required. You just get out there and duke it out.
Well, there are some in the ultimate fighting. There are rules specifically as to the type of strikes and kicks and things of that nature that are legal and not legal. But it brings up a good point, and it's kind of what I was alluding to earlier. A lot of that the lines get blurred with what are the tough man competitions and what, I think were popular 5 or 10 years ago that are different than the UFC per se, and a lot of the mixed martial arts that are, I don't want to say more serious, but the mixed martial arts has got, with their events, rules and that need to be followed. If you look at page 7 at the top on line 3, there's letter B that defines unarmed combat to include tough man fights, bad man fights, things of that nature, as well as nude boxing and nude wrestling. And I think that will get more to, where I think your question is going then. I hope does that help? I mean,
well, it does help, but that's actually what prompted the question. I was looking at page 7, section B, lines 3 through 5, and
yes,
it didn't really, none of that really covers what I understand to be ultimate fighting challenges. And then there's some, I guess you can't regulate everything anyway, but there's some of the challenges that a lot of the teenagers do called slamming, where they hit you harder and harder and harder and see how long you can stand it. I mean, so are you attempting to try to put some regulation to those things, or are you talking only professional, what you could pay and earn money for?
I think, yes, ma'am. We're looking at what this legislation would do is dealing more with the promoted events.
Okay.
That would be a fight night, things of that nature, ticket sales. There would be, a referee and things of that nature. The individual conduct between slamming and things like that, I don't know that we really want to go down into that area necessarily either.
Because it'll be on pay-per-view pretty soon.
Well, and some, like I said, I alluded to the felony fights, which puts out DVDs and it's all over YouTube. Those have been banned in many, many states, and as I understand it, most of those events occur in Mexico or in states that do not prohibit it.
Okay.
The language we have here today would prohibit those types of activities where, quite frankly, the intent of those events are to hurt somebody to the point where they may not be able to defend themselves. They may be incapacitated. There's no referee involved. It's not sanctioned by anybody. It's really just two guys going at it in the middle of the field, and we'd be able to crack down on some of that here.
Final follow-up, Mr. Chairman, if I may. Along the line of the EMT, that also struck me. Isn't it required by most venues what kind of medical personnel you should have and are required to have available if you sign a contract to host an event there?
Yes, ma'am. And for the wrestling in particular, and I know there's some representatives here from WWE and TNA, and for a lot of the organizations, as part of their standing operating procedure or as part of venue agreements and things like that, they will have provisions or already provide EMTs to be present for their events. As I said earlier, the one thing that this does will codify that at the bare minimum, a doctor appointed by the state will be present at all of these events, and will be observing, what occurs and things like that, and that would be codified here in the law, and I think that's a good
Would the
positive
state
step.
pay for that doctor?
Typically, it's paid for as part of the promotion.
Okay.
It would be one of the fees that the promoter would pay as part of the licensure or the permit for that event.
Thank you very much.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, got a lot of lights on. I think the next one was Chairman Franklin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I understood you correctly when you were answering about the rules adopted by the Commission, that you had indicated that if this bill does not pass, that the Commission is going to be adopting whatever rules it's going to do anyway. So either we have what this bill does, or the Commission's going to do something on its own. Did I understand that right?
I think that's fair. Yes, sir.
Because I believe it's on page 14 where we're saying the Commission shall administer the provisions of this chapter and shall have the authority to adopt rules pursuant to this chapter to implement the duties, including but not limited to. Which does it seem to you that gives you that same type of discretion that you're saying you're going to be exercising with or without this legislation?
I would say yes and no. I think for example, one of the rules that was suggested in the rulemaking process from the fall was dealt in the area of the conduct of the performers in a wrestling match. And obviously, and I hope I don't burst anyone's bubbles here, but professional...
Are you talking about wrestling or wrestling?
Wrestling.
Wrestling, okay.
Wrestling is choreographed. It's fake. It's scripted.
Wrestling is.
I'll wait for the reaction of the committee to that revelation. But that's right. And so, Mr. Chairman, as part of the consideration and kind of the backlash to that rule dealt with if these events are scripted and they're choreographed and the intent isn't to really, in essence, quote unquote, beat your opponent, that from a regulation standpoint, by rule or by law, the Commission doesn't need to get in the middle of all that. Mm-hmm. So what you'll see throughout these sections is, I think, a more narrow scope of what the Boxing Commission can and can't engage in, if you will, and takes it outside of that, or keeps those areas of conduct outside of their jurisdiction. Really, if you read throughout the bill, it's dealing with primarily the health and the safety of the performers, to an extent the public as well who are there at the events. There are some provisions dealing with the bonding and licensure, which I think helps make sure that the events come off as they're supposed to come off. But primarily it's dealing with the health and the safety of the performers and the public.
But you think, I might not have asked the question as clearly as I would have liked to. What I'm trying to address, or have you address, is the Commission setting rules or the General Assembly determining what you can do. Mm-hmm. And you would rather have the flexibility to make up the rules as you see fit, and rather than be restrained by parameters set by this body. Is that what I'm hearing?
No, sir. I think it's just the opposite. And
because it seems like the rules with language like including but not limited to gives you that same type of leeway that you're saying you already have under the existing law that would allow you to regulate wrestling, even though there's nothing in the code that specifically addresses that. And that's what concerns me, is the intent that you're coming in here telling us that the Commission intends to set its own rules pretty much regardless of what the law allows, when the current law doesn't even address the the performance of wrestling, but you've come in and told us that y'all intend to regulate that regardless of whether this bill gets passed, and that concerns me.
Oh, and I understand that concern, Mr. Chairman. I think a couple of things. First, the Secretary of State's office doesn't do the regulation and the licensure. This is the Boxing Commission, the Entertainment and Athletic Commission, by law is set up like our other professional licensing boards, which means from our standpoint, we don't have direct supervision or discretion over what they do and they don't.
But you do appoint their executive
we
director.
do appoint their executive director for ministerial purposes. I would say, and again, this is our office's opinion, that the provisions that are included in this bill are a lot more specific as to what the commission can and can't do in the way of licensure and regulation of wrestling, boxing, and MMA than what the current law provides today, and that was the impetus behind it. I think we're in a place where we want to set some, as I said, parameters as far as what they can and can't do in the promulgation of rules and procedures within this area, and not have them get into areas like conduct and things like that, which are rules that were presented in the fall. Which
gets back to my point. Why not just make sure we've got perfect legislation that sets out what those rules are, and we set them in the code?
To have the rulemaking process in the code?
No, to actually have this bill lay out what can and can't be done.
Well,
wouldn't that be the better way to do it?
Well, I would submit that that's what this bill does.
You're looking maybe for assurance that if this passes, that the Boxing Commission can do whatever they want to. Is that correct?
I'm concerned, since that's what they're doing now, that they will continue to do that regardless of what we pass. Right. And one thing I've noticed, if I could shift gears a little bit to page 11, notice in addition to regulating the athletes and the performers in these events, on line 12, you're also regulating those who broker the tickets. And I can see maybe regulating the performers, but what's the need to add ticket brokers?
Mr. Chairman, that's existing law.
It's got the double underline here.
It does, but the existing law puts ticket brokers under the jurisdiction of the Entertainment and Athletic Commission as well. So we did not make any additions to those parts of the code, or we didn't really deal with any of that as part of this bill. That's existing law today.
So you wouldn't object to removing ticket brokers from this bill since it's already in the existing code? Is that what you're saying?
Well, since I would have to see what that would look like. I guess part of the question would be what would be the committee and the House's will in dealing with ticket brokers, period. Would it be to get rid of ticket brokerage regulation altogether?
No, I'm just curious as to why a bill that's purported and as it was presented to us provides for safety of these performers, that why we've got ticket brokers being regulated as brand new language in here.
Well, it is in that particular sentence, but it's not. It says the responsibilities and what the Boxing Commission does have oversight of, and it adds ticket brokers as well as mixed martial arts and kickboxing in that definition.
As the commission being the sole regulator of those.
And that's existing law today.
So since it's existing law, you would not object to an amendment to remove ticket brokers from this bill?
In that particular section?
Since you're saying it's existing law.
I'd have to see what the impact of the... I'd have to look at it.
Because it's either existing law or it's not, isn't it?
Well, it is, but if you're talking about just striking the two references to ticket brokers in Section A, I don't know what that would be, the impact of that compared to the current law would be. Like I said, if you want to take out ticket brokers across the board, that's one decision
not what I'm
point.
talking about. I'm talking about why we're giving the commission sole regulation of ticket brokers on page 11 of this bill when it was presented to this committee that this bill is for the health and safety of those performing these events. And I don't really see how someone selling a ticket would be involved in either the health or safety of the performer.
Well, they wouldn't. If it was, I don't know that I would object to striking ticket broker references in Section A. If that's, I mean.
And if I might, Mr. Chairman, one further question. On page 10, line 16, notice the current composition of the commission is 5 members appointed by the governor. Would you have any opposition to having 2 of the members appointed by the Speaker of the House, 2 of the members appointed by the Lieutenant Governor, and 1 member appointed by the governor?
Yes.
You would object to that?
Yes. Okay. And the reason for that is we have 36 professional licensing boards under our jurisdiction. 35 of those boards are appointed by the governor. Mm-hmm. And this existing law and this language has been modeled after those licensure laws as well.
Mr. Chairman,
at the proper time, I'd like to move some amendments.
Okay, we're not there yet. We've got a number of questions. Representative Cole.
In reference to Chairman Franklin's about the ticket brokers, this bill does, from reading it, deal a lot with, the protection of the people actually performing. But there are provisions in here that protect the integrity of the people watching, the safety of them. So I would implore that the ticket brokers, some type of regulation, might be indeed not to protect the people performing, but the actual people that are paying and keeping these sports going as well.
I can see protecting the public. You've got the 5-foot buffer, the 3-foot tall barricade that's sturdy. That would provide the protection for the spectator. But it seems I don't see where someone selling broken a ticket really fits into either one of those.
Well, I would want financial protection too. I mean, I would want the integrity of my ticket to be. I wouldn't want them to print up, a sold-out event and print up 2,000 extra fake tickets, and then I get a fake one and not be able to get in to watch. I mean, I would assume that's somewhere where that provision helps protect that part of it.
Thank you, Representative Cole. Was that all, Chairman Franklin?
That's all
for the
I
moment.
can think of for the moment.
Okay.
But I'm sure we might think of something else.
I understand. All right. Still got a number of lights here. Representative Everson, and then Representative Setzler, and then I think Representative Abrams would be third. Nope. Representative Lunsford, then. Okay, that's the batting order. Representative Everson.
Mr. Chairman, I waive.
He waives. Representative Setzler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I must confess, I have to crack a smile when we deal with this. These are issues that when I joined the legislature, I never thought we'd be legislating.
Us either.
But I do it again. It's something that needs to be done. I do have a question though as we go through this. On page 31, and I'm sure there's a reason for it. I just need to understand what that is. Looking at page 31, lines 3 through 15. I'm going to read some of this just to really highlight where my questions lie. It talks about the commission executive director may appoint officials to really for enforcement. Officials shall have access to all areas of the venue, including the locker rooms, dressing areas, backstage area. And of course, the promoter can have someone accompany those officials. Then it goes on in line 7, says, for any event in which it is anticipated there will be more than 1,000 spectators present, the officials must leave the backstage area at least 1 hour prior to the start of the event. That's my first question. An official shall not have access to locker rooms or dressing rooms areas at any time when performers are dressing, showering, or preparing for the performance. Just walk me through why that is.
The hour of the event, and
why are we
sure.
saying we have regulatory authority, but the officials can't be backstage 1 hour prior to the event, or while performers are preparing for a performance? I mean,
Yep.
is there a fear that an official is going to step out and say, Blackjack Mulligan's going to win the Texas cage match? And my imagination runs wild when I consider that. So.
Yes, sir, Representative Sussler. And I'll say, honestly, that has been one of the most debated provisions of this entire bill. And what this is language that was basically brought forward, I guess, for two reasons. The first, the showering and the dressing language, which is on line 11 and the preparing for the performance. For some of the larger promotions with TNA and WWE, they do have female talent, female stars of their events. And since the overwhelming majority of our inspectors and those involved with the commission are male, there was some concern about backstage or locker room access prior to an event while female talent may be getting ready for the performance. So that's the best way I could describe that provision. That also leads to the 1 hour prior to the start of the event. As I understand it, and I think the representatives of those organizations might be able to speak more specifically to it, in the run-up to the event or the start of the performance or their part of the performance, many of the performers are going through the performance themselves backstage prior to coming forward for their part of the event. So that 1 hour provision was to give the performers the opportunity to, I guess the best way to put it, go through their paces, if you will, prior to their performance occurring, and have it be unencumbered rather than the possibility of others seeing it. But that would be my best explanation for it.
And ask the question, I want to be friendly to this process. And this is not an unfriendly question per se. I just, to the extent this whole activity needs to be regulated, and we could debate how much it needs to be regulated, how much it might not need to be regulated, but to the extent there's a need for regulation, there's a concern for safety, there's a concern for compliance with certain laws. I don't know the history of the sport. If there's ever, I know certainly in baseball and some of the other sports, there's been concerns about improper use of, in track and field blood doping and those kind of things. I have no clue what the context is that these regulations are being written, if that applies to the sport at all or not. So, my question doesn't imply that. I just, to the extent this needs to be regulated, I don't know that, that associations that regulate sports, the NCAA, for example, private organization, I don't know that that it's written into their bylaws that says an NCAA inspector can't be backstage or can't be in the locker room during a women's soccer event while they're showering. I just think that's understood. That's not really a necessary provision. I'm really trying to laser in on not what might be, but what the real need is for this language. And again, it's not an unfriendly question. I just, to the extent there needs to be regulation, you would think regulators should have generally unfettered access. And if there's no need to be back there and there's no need to be there while someone's showering, they would just excuse themselves. I just offer that the offer.
That's a good point, and I'll make some personal examples about, and I see the need for it because after I played 6 years for Milwaukee, and we were always notified. There was during the time I was playing was always that was the occurrence of the female reporter, and the notification that prior at this period of time there'll be female reporters inside the locker room. So we were notified. We had to abide by it because of sometimes just common respect. Vice versa, I could see where that would be you could have a male regulator in a female event or a female regulator in a male event. As far as the regulation, does this need to be regulated? And you were talking about earlier that when you got in the legislature, did you think that this would be something that you regulated? I look at baseball as a current example. People ask me all the time, well, you're in politics and you played baseball. What are your opinions? And 100% convinced if baseball's not going to do it themselves, then someone has to do it for them. Because when I played, it was a joke. I mean, I watched steroids used. My roommates used them. Baseball was to blame. They knew it was going on. It was after 94 strike. Nobody wanted to come to the ballpark and watch a 1-0 pitching duel. They wanted to see home runs. They wanted to get people back in the stands. They knew it was going on. Baseball is to blame for that. So I never had anything to hide. Someone asked me earlier, do you think it should be, when we were playing ball, at any point in time, my locker could be searched, my bags could be searched, my personal belongings in my locker could be searched for tobacco, alcohol, things of that nature. A drug test at any time. I mean, they could pull me off the field in batting practice and say it's time your drug test. So if you're not doing anything wrong, I never feared it because I wasn't doing anything wrong. So if you're trying to protect the integrity of what you're promoting, access should be unfettered. With certain provisions that that we do protect and respect gender and people's feelings. And
so to the author, let me just ask again. It's not intended to be an unfriendly question. I mean, is there a need to have this hour blackout zone where regulators don't have access, or can that be worked through gentlemen's agreements and understandings, and this just sort of takes care of itself? I'm just, again, to the extent this needs to be regulated, do we need to have a regulatory blackout right before the event? It's just a simple question.
I think so. Just as we had a certain period afterwards that female reporters were allowed in the locker room. I mean, it was set. It was, and we had to adhere to it. It's just a different day and age, and I think we have to constantly, accommodate, different circumstances.
Mr. Chair, can I ask one more question? Again, subsection D, 12 through 15, just a clarifying question. Except as expressly provided, talks about shall not have any jurisdiction to control the manner in which the event's conducted, putting the dress while engaged in the event. What I don't want to do in this, and again, I'm just these things are coming to me as we talk through this. So I hadn't thought through and scripted this just yet, but I understand there's a certain expectation of maybe good taste isn't the right word. I'm not sure that all wrestlers dress in good taste, but I guess the sense of we're not going to be. There are certain laws that define nudity and certain laws that define other. Again, it's another issue that's a whole can of worms there. Are we allowing this regulatory body to not have the ability to say that is nudity, you've crossed the line here, or are we going to depend on other definitions that define nudity to try to cover that? My concern is when we put this in the code, we're saying dress isn't regulated, so if they cross some line which is nudity or something that's allowable by television at certain hours, that we're exempting them somehow by this language. Could you speak to that, please?
Yes, sir. I believe it was Justice Stevens who had the famous line in a Supreme Court case that he doesn't know that he could define pornography, but he knows it when he sees it. I think Potter Stewart. I'm sorry. I think in some degree that's kind of the area we're in here now, because some of these things are purely subjective in nature. We have provisions earlier that strictly prohibit nude events, whether wrestling or boxing and things like that. And I think, frankly, that's just going to have to be something that we see what happens. I don't know that we could define it in the code today to say what is nude, what is not nude. And I don't know really that, and I could be wrong depending on the feeling of the committee is in the legislature, that we would want our inspectors running around with tape measures measuring the lengths of garments, the size of things, and things like that either.
And I'm not suggesting that. I guess my question might have been better phrased. Is there specific language in the code section that deals with the commission here that speaks to nudity, and is nudity covered? Again, I wouldn't hold myself out to be as the police of appropriate dress, but to the extent it's addressed, is nudity addressed in this code section somewhere?
I don't know if it is from a definition standpoint, which I think is kind of what you're looking for. Is that?
I want to make sure we're not allowing nudity to happen unintentionally. That's what I'm looking to.
It's part of existing law, I think, isn't it?
That would be my.
Yeah, there's no change. My understanding is there's no change to existing law in that regard that's in this bill. Is that accurate?
Yes.
I know that's the intent. I just wanted to ask the author and members of the committee if they're comfortable that's the case as it's drafted.
And if I may just briefly on the question you had before with the 1 hour blackout period, again, I think it's almost a catch-22. The intent to have inspectors be able to have access backstage and offstage is to make sure there's no illicit activities going on, be it drug use, alcohol use, minors who haven't been accompanied back, or whatever it may be. That being said, if a performer or somebody involved with the event is going to engage in illicit activity, they may very well do it when they're not backstage. They could do it in the hotel, they could do it outside, or wherever it may be. So I think what we've come up with here, and again, this was one of the real debated points in really the negotiations to bring this bill forward in the language that we have here, is to find a balance, if you will, to have some access in these areas just to make sure that things are okay, but also being respectful of the performers and their preparations for the events, both the showering and the dressing room areas and things like that, and whatever things they may be running through from an actual performance standpoint with whomever they're engaged with.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, can I have a point of clarification on some comments I made about the steroid? And just real quick, at the point in time I said that everybody knew what was going on. Well, nothing was banned. There were no banned substances, but we all knew that it wasn't Mama's steak and potatoes that they were getting their strength from. So that's the problem I had, is that baseball didn't ban anything. It was just swept under the rug, not that there was illegal use. That's the key thing that I see in a lot of this testimony. Cameras are here.
I'm glad you noticed. Okay, Representative Lunsford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll admit that I haven't read this bill word for word. I've been trying as we've been moving along, but I do have a couple questions. On page 17, line 29, if you could move there with me for a second, Rob, and go through it. The Commission shall have the exclusive jurisdiction to issue, withhold, suspend, or revoke a license or permit required under this chapter. My question is there an appeal process? So you decide that you've got someone, and you decide we're going to suspend his license. Is there a method of appeal in here? And I've looked for it. I haven't found it, but there may very well be one in here.
Yes, sir, Representative Lunsford. The processes for this board are the same as it are for our other licensing boards. It's the administrative law process would be part of that for the appeal and the denial of the license and things like that.
Any process for appeal to a superior court or to a jury
I don't know.
on any of the revocations?
Have we had that? I don't believe so. I'd have to.
Yeah, because there's a lot of things in America we can give up. I'm not so concerned about a vote sometimes, but I don't think we should ever give up the right of a jury trial for anything, or if we feel we've been done wrong. But I was just curious about the appeal process. You've got an administrative law judge gets the final say, so I guess then that would have to then come back before the commission to confirm his ruling. Is that the way it works?
I believe so.
I think we have a lawyer sitting behind you that maybe has read this bill from front to back. One of you guys.
I am an attorney, but I'm a member of the Administrative Procedures Act would govern that, and the ALJ judge.
Okay.
If it was a fundamental right, if you could define something as a property right, someone would take it. It would seem one of these gentlemen over here might adjudicate that. If it was a fundamental right.
Okay.
I don't know if they're in agreement with that.
If I could follow up, Mr. Chairman, I just want to make sure there was an appeal process covered. On page 22, line 29, we talk about the promoter should provide an insurance policy, and I feel it kind of comical that we'll provide an insurance policy so each participant shall be covered by a minimum of $25,000 health, $50,000 life, which will cover the injuries and death. I don't know if anybody's been to the hospital lately. $25,000 is not going to cover a whole lot of injuries, and $50,000 is not going to cover a whole lot of deaths. Was there a reason you guys settled on that dollar amount?
I think for the most part that's the industry standard for what other states are doing in this area. That would be the real reason behind it. A lot of this language has come from laws that are in some of our surrounding jurisdictions.
Okay. Is that fairly standard? Is that what you guys concur, and that's fairly standard in the country?
That's actually a little bit above industry standard. Industry standard is 20,000 and 20,000, and I share the same concerns, 25,000 and 50,000.
Okay. I just want to make sure the person gets hurt, that they're covered at least to get out of the hospital. Page 23, line 15, if we could, if it's okay, Mr. Chairman, if I continue. Sure. In a sanctioned championship title match, whenever the commission representative has reason to believe that a participant has ingested, used, or prohibited drug, why are we not just taking a urine specimen in a championship fight from both people ahead of time and setting them on the shelf and not testing them unless you reasonably believe that they were doing? Now, because here we're using someone's judgment. In other words, in my judgment, he looked glassy-eyed, or he looked like he had more energy than he normally has. I want a urine specimen from him, but the guy that lost, I don't necessarily want a urine specimen from him. In a championship fight, why don't we just take a specimen from both to begin with?
I think it actually says that in there to both. But if you test one of the participants, you have to test the other.
I didn't find that. Is it?
It's under C, I think 24 and 25.
Okay. All right. Got it. Perfect. You answered my question. I just wanted to make sure we were fair. So the hometown favorite didn't win, so you test the other guy. Page 25, here's our administrative procedures. Is that correct?
The APA is listed in several of the code sections, but not all of them.
But they would all apply, Jill?
I think it starts at
Because
32.
I'm finding it spelled. That was what brought up my question on the previous part, because it's spelled out here in this code section, but I didn't see it in some of the previous code sections.
It's on page 21, too, in that code section. There's a couple places in here.
Do you, Mr. Chairman, can I ask of Legislative Counsel? Is that okay? Ms. Jill, she doesn't have to answer me. That's correct. It wouldn't be the first time, Mr. Chairman, but I got a question. If we were trying to make sure that this entire procedure was covered with the right of appeal by a participant or promoter, rather than address it in separate code sections individually, some we've addressed it and some we haven't, could we not put in a paragraph that this entire procedure falls under the Administrative Act so that there's always an appeal process somewhere? Because I think that's what he was expressing. That was their intent, correct?
I think, if you look at page 25, lines 32 through 36, to some degree it does that. It just doesn't incorporate, I'm not sure what article we're in right here. It obviously doesn't mention Article 2A, which is the new article. I think that partially gets you there.
It does. It didn't have anything to do with suspension, so.
And
And that's what I was concerned with. If you suspended a person, I didn't see an appeal procedure. I only saw it for the other portions. Is there one on 19, Stacey? Commission Chapter 13, Title 15. I think that was a granting of a license provision, I think. Is it? Yes. No. You're a better lawyer than I am. I'm not one. That is great praise. Somebody went to Princeton versus a guy who plays it 40 days a year.
I think the question you originally posed was with respect to page 17, which is 43-4B-11, and then 43-4B-13 is where the language of the APA is, and then you have the global.
Yes, ma'am. That was on the 43-4B-11. I didn't see any administrative law procedure in that code section. I don't know if we're just assuming it's covered or not. I got an answer from her, Mr. Chairman. So if we went back to 25 or what was it, 19, where we had the Procedure Act, if we included the 43-4B11, I see. I'm right there with you on line 18.
Also subject to 43-4B19. 4B19 is where we were reading in the APA, so it does look like this one covers under 11 now.
So your opinion that we sufficiently covered all their appeal processes, you think? Or suspensions? Well, Mr. Chairman, you just answered all my questions.
Always aim to please. Now, did you have something to add? Okay. Okay, and I was simply, we had one person already talking, so. Representative Levitas is here, and his interest has been stimulated in this issue, and he has a question. Representative Levitas.
I promise I did not do that.
It's your friend from Rockdale County.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask of the sponsor of legislation, moving over to page 31, 43-4B-20.9, specifically under subsection C. I have seen that kind of language before in other code sections, but I guess what I'm a little concerned about is the nature of the misleading, deceptive, untrue, or fraudulent statements. That strikes me as perhaps a little broad, and I guess my question is there any reason we didn't just put in there any person who knowingly and intentionally makes a false statement of fact on any documentation? That just, I'm sort of concerned about how broad that provision is.
I don't, Mr. Chairman, Representative Levitas, I think the concern and the reason it's worded the way it is to ensure the accuracy of the documentation that is going to be presented to the Commission, and that's the way it was written. I think.
Let me ask it a different way. Do you have any objection to changing that language to making it so we're capturing somebody who's knowingly and intentionally making a false statement? When you start getting into misleading, deceptive, untrue, or fraudulent statements, that opens up the well pretty broad. And I just wonder if we couldn't. We've already got 2 criminal provisions above that, and as you probably may or may not know, I'm not exactly the person they turn to when they're trying to weaken criminal provisions here, but I think that while it's important to capture bad conduct, we don't want to open it up too broad and capture folks that somebody, I think Representative Lunsford gave the example that the hometown guy's there and maybe we don't like him or her, and I'd be a little concerned and ask you to consider whether we can get rid of those, the listing of those different descriptive terms and just make it false. It's either true or it's not true.
I think if that was the will of the committee, we wouldn't necessarily object to it. But we wanted to make sure that the accuracy was truly there in the submittals, and that's why it was written the way it is. But I don't know that we'd strenuously object to that.
Well, Mr. Chairman, at the appropriate time, I'll have a motion. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Levitas. All right, I think that's all the questions that we have at this point in time. Representative Black is here. He had signed up to speak, and I'm going to ask him or recognize him at this time to. Okay.
If this is an agreement with you, I'll stand, and that way maybe.
Just make yourself at home.
I will. First off, I had some concerns about the bill that passed the Senate that removed the convicted felon. The chairman's already taken care of that with the amendment you have drawn up. But in sitting and listening to the discussion here, there's a few things that I felt like that I needed to say, and I think first I need to qualify myself and tell you that there are people in the room that know a lot more about mixed martial arts than I do. But there is a fellow back home that's a friend of mine that owns a martial arts school. And 15 years ago, I helped him put on his first martial arts contest, and been involved in it ever since. I had a couple of boys that were wrestlers in high school, and I've traveled all over Florida and Georgia and Tennessee following wrestling, and I do know a little something about wrestling. I will tell you this, a couple of the prior speakers have made mention that professional wrestling was choreographed. Well, I'm going to tell you something. First off, mixed martial arts covers a broad spectrum from the ultimate wrestling to the amateur, small professional events like what I have seen. And the ultimate wrestling is choreographed to a degree. And the way they choreograph it is the ultimate fighting allows boxing, martial arts, and wrestling. But if a fella goes in there and he does too much wrestling, he don't get to come back to another bout. He doesn't get a contract. And that's the way they play it. You go to what I call an amateur or something like what is put on by these martial arts schools, it don't look like what you see on television when you watch Ultimate Fighting. There might be a few fists slung, might be a kick every now and then, but most of them is going to end up on the mat. It's not exciting what these promoters want to have put on television. Now, it would suit me if you could outlaw this mixed martial arts stuff that you see on television, Ultimate Fighting, because I know enough wrestling to sit there and watch those contestants, to see them turn their back on the opportunities to go to the mat, put a fella down, put a chokehold on him, or put a twisting hold on him that will cause him to tap out. Because they know that if they win this match by that method, they won't be back for another match. My concern and what I want to encourage you to do is think about all over this state, we've got people that are operating these martial arts academies and schools, and most of them will try to make them somewhat of a family affair. They'll have the kids come down and they'll teach them kung fu and kickboxing and all these different, they'll have classes for women. But to operate one of these schools, it's sort of like operating a dance academy. I mean, you can bring the kids down and teach them dancing, but sometimes you got to take them out on the road and let them show the stuff. My daughter took ballet for 10 years, and I didn't watch Nutcracker so many times I could probably didn't see it. And you can have a mixed martial arts school or a martial arts school, but if all they do is just scuffle around there with the folks in the neighborhood, that ain't going to keep that mixed martial arts school open. Sometimes you got to ride down the road and butt heads with some of them fellas down there. And my judgment, these local martial arts schools, if we keep them clean and above board, keep them family-oriented businesses, it's a good activity for the community, it's good for the state, and I think that I want to encourage you, and looking at the bill that you've got before you, to craft some things that will allow these folks to stay in business. I want to thank the commissioner. He's already worked with my friend back home and getting some of the things. And he's got some fees in there that my man says he can live with. But I'm going to tell you this, if you could see fit, maybe even just these fees a little bit more to take care of these little guys who are trying to get started, because I remember the first year that we had a mixed martial arts, all right, there was only a couple of mixed martial arts. They had like 50 paying customers show up. And you can't pay expensive fees when you're just getting started out with something like that. Mr. Chairman, I thank you and appreciate the opportunity to be heard.
Thank you, Representative Black, and we're pleased to have you with us. And you're okay with this bill now?
I'm fine with it.
Okay, all right. Just wanted to be sure. I value your input. Representative Lunsford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. After stepping out of the room and consulting with a couple attorneys, I still think we have a little bit of a hole in the bill as far as the appeal process, and so at the appropriate time I'd like to try to make a motion for an amendment, sir.
All right. Any further questions? Did y'all have anyone else you wanted us to hear from before we take up the bill?
From our side.
Okay. All right. If my memory serves me correctly, I had 3 members that wanted to be recognized for amendments, and we're not quite there, but Chairman Franklin, Representative Levitas, and Representative Lunsford. Okay, and possibly Vice Chairman Mumford. What is the will of the committee? All right, we have a motion that Senate Bill 413 be given a due pass recommendation. That has been seconded. So that puts that, with that motion, we're now in a position to take up amendments. Chair will first recognize, and I'm going to do this in the order in which people ask to be recognized. Chairman Franklin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would move an amendment on page 10, line 16, that the commission shall be composed of 5 members, 2 appointed by the Speaker of the House, 2 appointed by the Lieutenant Governor, and 1 appointed by the Governor.
What line what were you on?
Line 16 of page 10.
So you're doubling the membership.
No, sir. I'm keeping 5 members.
I'm sorry. 2, 2, and 1?
2, 2, and 1 instead of 0, 0, and 5.
Okay. All right.
Is it in proper place for me to object?
It is. I have a question from a committee member. Is that about the amendment? Are you waving off for the moment? Okay. Representative Cole, do you want to be heard on the amendment?
I just respectively ask the committee to object to that and keep things as uniform as they are currently in Secretary of State office with the 35 commissions. It would just, I think, it'd be a wrong message and a mixed bag if we have some that are half appointed, some aren't, some fully. So, in the sake of uniformity, I'd appreciate to defeat that amendment.
I have supported this suggestion by Chairman Franklin in another instance or two when it's matters that originate here in the legislature. Let me ask a question, Mr. Sims. Are there any other of these commissions currently under the purview of the Secretary of State that have legislative appointments?
I believe there's one out of the 36.
Which one is that?
The Athletic Agents Licensing Board, which is, I think, fair to say, is a board that was set up really almost ceremonial in nature. They meet once a year. They don't really have a tremendous amount of regulatory authority or discretion.
Okay.
The remaining 35 in Title 43 are governor appointments.
I just have a question. Why are they not Secretary of State appointments?
Well, now you're going down a totally different road.
I mean, that just occurred to me.
Historically, it's always been appointments of the governor. We have licensing boards under our administration that go back to the 1930s, and they were created and given the authority by appointee of the governor, or through the governor's appointees, or I should say through the legislature in which the governor had the appointees. I really can't speak to why they wouldn't be.
Would you want them?
Not on this bill that's before you today, but I'd be happy to entertain that discussion.
Fair answer.
In subsequent sessions.
Okay. you're a member of the committee, Representative Cole. You have objected to the Franklin amendment. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Did the Franklin amendment? Let me go back. Is there a second to the Franklin amendment? Okay, we have a second now with an objection. All right. So, is there? I know you have other amendments.
I have other amendments.
Let's just take them one at a time, if that's agreeable. Sure. Is there any discussion on the first Franklin amendment? Chairman Cooper, I'm sorry, your light was flashing too.
Do I understand that there's 5 people on this commission, and that would give 2 to that would mean that the governor had 1. If this, and everybody else had 2. If this bill is important enough to pass and be signed by the governor, I mean, I think putting him in the minority certainly would not be something he'd want, and we're pretty much saying that this bill is not going to be signed into law, and I think it's too important for that. So I would like to put in my objection to the amendment.
Representative Levitas?
Waive, sir.
Waives. All right. Any further discussion on Franklin Amendment number 1? I paused too long.
You did.
Representative Levitas.
To address the chairman's concern, Madam Chairman's concern, just to the author, would the author consider an amendment that would make the governor have more of a say in it rather than one appointment? Or does the chairman wish to stand on his amendment as proposed? In other words, to increase, maybe give him the governor's office 2 votes rather than, or 2 appointments. Maybe 3, 1, and 1, something along those lines.
1, 2, 2, and the 1 being the Secretary of State rather than the governor.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Setzler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just say to the author of the amendment, I do share your concern that broadly across the state, the legislature ought to increasingly share appointments. However, I don't think doing it in a piecemeal way is the way to approach it. I would almost, I think it would be a worthwhile task of this legislature to next year and subsequent years look across all the appointments and determine which ones might more aptly be legislative appointments, which ones might more aptly be gubernatorial appointments and should stay, and we deal with it holistically. I think for that purpose I'm going to oppose the amendment, but I think I certainly support the spirit of what you've offered, but I don't know that this is the time or place to do that.
Point well made, and could we also, when we have that discussion, put the Secretary of State in that mix too? Okay. Further discussion on the first Franklin Amendment. Hearing none, all in favor of the Franklin Amendment number 1, please indicate by raising your right hand. All opposed, raise your right hand. Amendment failed. Okay, that amendment fails. Chairman Franklin's recognized again.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 11, on lines 12 and 14 and 15, delete ticket brokers.
Okay, page 11, lines 12 and 14.
Yeah, beginning on 14, ending on 15.
Correct, okay. Is that the only place that appears?
That is all
it
I
appears
saw.
to be the case, okay.
It's in there.
Yeah, you want to
so amended. You probably need to stick the "and" in front of mixed martial arts,
right,
in both places. I try. But is this the only place where it's in this bill? Where else is it in the bill?
It is on page 3, line 9, on page 4, line 18, on page 15, the definition of it is on line.
Watch it just momentarily. I'll be right back.
And
No.
the word is used again on line 25. And let me back up a second. I'm just going to note that on page 1, line 12, you notice that the whole design of this bill is leaving Article 3 unchanged. And Article 3 is the regulation of ticket brokers. So if you were to take the definition out, you'd have 12 code sections that wouldn't have any, would have difficulty in meaning because the definition is gone. The word ticket broker.
It's part of the bill.
Sure there isn't any other place.
Is there any further discussion of the amendment? Is there a second of the amendment? I assume you're objecting to it?
Yes.
All right.
Thank you.
The author has objected. I would like for somebody to tell me whether there's a second for this amendment or not. All right. Representative Lunsford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could, who regulates ticket brokers today?
By statute, the Entertainment and Athletic Commission, the Boxing Commission, has that responsibility right now.
And their purview falls under whose office?
Secretary of State's.
So, in essence, they actually have the purview to regulate them today.
Yes, sir.
So, what effect would this amendment of striking out the word ticket broker have on current law, considering the fact that you currently regulate them today, and all we're going to do is take them out of this bill, but your previous regulations, current Georgia code, would still stand?
Yes, sir. And that was part of my question when Chairman Franklin raised this earlier in the hearing today. He expressed an interest in striking it in those two areas, but as Legislative Counsel has pointed out, it's already...
You've answered enough questions. All right, thank you, sir. I know whether I want a second or not now, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Is there a second for Chairman Franklin's amendment regarding ticket brokers? Chairman Franklin, I am not hearing a second. The author has objected. I believe that dies as a matter of lack of a second.
So does that take us to Franklin Amendment number 3?
Yes, sir.
All
Hopefully
right.
I can turn it back over to the chairman.
All right. On page 16.
What's all these lights blinking? Huh?
You were going
Oh.
to get everybody mad.
Okay. Yeah, that one's broken. Okay. Franklin Amendment number 3.
All right. On page 16, this would be on lines 9 and lines 31 to take the fees back to the original $250 from the $1,000 that the bill proposes the change to. So it would be to replace $1,000 in those two instances to $250.
Does everyone understand the third Franklin Amendment? Is there a second?
I'll second for purposes of discussion.
Okay. We're on discussion.
And I was out of the room, but why? That's a significant increase in the amount. So I'd like to hear.
Representative Benfield, let me first of all make one inquiry. Does the author object?
Yes.
Okay. Now, Representative Benfield, and I would join her in wanting to know why that was raised from $250 in current law to $1,000.
Well, I would, before he addresses, I'd like to point out it says a fee not to exceed $1,000, so there's discretion.
You and I both know that if that's going to go to $1,000 if you give them that ceiling. Sure. You're Mr. Farr?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Currently, an article that provides for the regulation of mixed martial arts, the fee for that license is $500. So it's actually actually in excess of the 250. And the purpose for the $1,000 is we've gone through a lot of work to get this bill to where everybody will agree on it. We're hoping we don't have to revisit it anytime soon. That's just in there for inflationary purposes.
Mr. Chairman, if I may also, you'll notice throughout the bill that the way it is written in the definition of promoter, it treats boxing promoters and MMA promoters essentially the same. The fees on the boxing side were a little bit different, as Mr. Farr pointed out, as to where they are in the MMA. I think the commission itself would exercise some discretion on setting that fee based on the size of the promotion, the event, and things of that nature, which is why it's not a flat $1,000 fee, and it's set under not to exceed.
If I could just add one thing further, like the current, it says right now it's not to exceed $50. Well, the actual charge for that promoter's fee for a boxer's license is only $150. So they don't have a history of going to the ceiling of it. I mean, there's generally industry standards to states and what they charge for certain types of fees, and the boxing commission typically hits those. I mean, you can attest to that.
That a satisfactory explanation? Follow up.
I have a motion.
Okay. Let me, if I could, come back to you because I had some other questions. I'm sorry. Okay. So you're off. Representative Lunsford.
Yeah, I must have had too much caffeine today, Mr. Chairman.
Next to me, Mr. Chairman, it's contagious.
It's bad. Mr. Chairman, I have a question, if I could get an opinion of the chair. In the last 2 days, we've seen a number of Senate bills come to the House chamber. As of yesterday, Chairman Lewis was carrying one. The House, at its discretion, determined it was a revenue bill because it raised a fee and originated in the Senate. I had Senate Bill 406 today that was rolled over till tomorrow and recommitted back to rule. It was determined it was a revenue bill because the fees had been raised. I don't have a problem philosophically with your fee. If you don't have a problem philosophically with your bill dying in the House, if it gets determined to be a revenue bill and originating in the Senate and unconstitutional and sent back to rules, but we're about out of time, though. So I would caution this committee and ask the opinion of this chair if this could be determined a revenue bill originating in the Senate, in which case it would become invalid on the House floor and sent back.
If we left it at 250,
it would not be the answer.
I think it would not be.
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my objection at the proper time.
Okay.
Save the equipment for a different day.
All right. Well, I think, I mean, that would be my determination, but I think the author has taken care of that. Do you have anything further, Representative Benfield?
No, I was going to move to change the amount to 500, but in light of the Representative Lunsford's insight on this, I'll withdraw that.
Okay.
Yeah, that was. Are there any other places in the bill it's raised?
Jill, do you,
It's raised, but on page 17, line 15, it's $1,000. I don't know how that would be viewed with the issue that Representative Lunsford. That's a criminal.
As long as it's a new fee, it wasn't determined yesterday in the House for the revenue bills, but anything that raised the fee was a member of Ways and Means typically contested it, and the bill died and sent back to rules or sent back to the Senate.
what about page 17, Representative Cole? Are those new fees?
Let me check with my counsel.
Sure. While they're doing that, did you have a question, Chairman Franklin? Okay.
No. What page was the initial question on?
I think
Yes, if I could have, we're about to be enlightened. If we could maybe tone down the conversation a little bit, Mr. Sims.
I think for certain, to that question, on it's lines 19 and 31 on page 16, which, as you can see through the strike-throughs, are what would be an increase or a possible increase in fees with the not-to-exceed language. I don't believe that there are increases in existing fees in other areas, but
well, let me ask the question a little more pointedly,
okay.
and feel free, Mr. Farr, to help us out with this, because, and maybe it's just the chair's view, but these these two fees on page 17 in lines 15 and 16 appear to be even more problematic than the other fee that we dealt with. Are these new fees, or is there something in current law? It doesn't look like there's current law on that by looking at the bill.
The promoter or matchmaker fee, they currently exist. Where within statute, I've got to look, but like the promoter license is actually provided for in 43.4B10. When you say $1,000, that's the same $1,000 you're talking about.
So we need to move that to 250 again.
Right.
So the answer is what?
So I think we would need to, if for the consistency in the amendment, to move that back to 250. If you're going to change it in 9 and 31, I think line 15 would, safety's sake, would need to move back to 250 as well. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. And if you look in the strike-through part, I don't know the line number.
I think it's line 3 at the top of that page. Yeah.
That's for that right there. That's the same thing.
Okay. Yeah. I think that would need to be moved down to 250 as well. I think the $100 in line 16 actually represents a reduction from the 250 in the strike-through in line 23. If we're reading that correctly.
Okay, so for this not to be a revenue increasing bill, then on line are you saying on line 15 we would need to change that amount from 1,000 to 250?
I think that's correct. Yes, sir.
Let me hang on one second, Representative Setzler, and then leave 16 at $100 because that's actually a reduction.
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. Representative Setzler.
Mr. Chairman, again, I feel like we're splitting hairs here, but just to if we're going to split the hair, let's make sure we're doing it right. I don't know that that the position of the chair with respect to revenue bills in the House and Senate deals just with revenue increases. It would seem a revenue decrease, anything that impacts revenue would be in question. I would suggest that even a reduction from 250 to 100 would be out of order. That we ought to leave. That line 16 ought to read not to exceed 250 so as that this bill would have no impact on revenue, positive or negative.
Sounds good.
The only problem is that if to be consistent, if we're raising a fee, then do we run afoul of that?
Mr. Chair, I think that 250 is the same amount. If you look at the line 23, that's the 250 strike through, which would be in line 16. So you would.
So we go back to 250.
Yes, sir. To
okay.
Representative Setzler's point.
All right.
So as to have no impact on revenue.
You offering that as an amendment, Representative Setzler?
I'd be prepared to at the proper time.
Or a friendly amendment.
You're actually would be amending. Okay, this is really
an amendment to the Franklin Amendment.
An amendment to the Franklin Amendment, which is not. Is there an? You want to second that one, the amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I would second the.
Okay.
The Franklin Amendment's already been seconded. I'd like to offer an amendment to the amendment or a substitute.
Let's do an amendment to the amendment. Is there a second to that? Is there objection, Representative Cole? Okay, that's going to. Is there objection from the committee? Hearing none, the third Franklin amendment as amended has been adopted. Did that take care of you? 1 out of 3. Yes. Okay.
I frankly don't know how these fall, but if I could on page 28, is there annual license fee on line 23 of 100 for a certain number of wrestlers, line 26 250, line 28 500, and then over on page 29, line 28, non-refundable fee. I just did a search for dollars to see. I don't know if that's mirroring existing law.
Are those 3 all that's left? Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay. Representative Cole and Mr. Sims, let's just have a little discussion here. How do we make those fees on pages 28 and 29 be consistent with what we've been doing here?
The rest of the fee will be $100.
I'm sorry?
The part of it for the promoter's fees, that would be $100 for all of them. Just the
That's what it is now. Okay. How about the promoter? Well,
for a wrestler, it does not exist.
I'm sorry.
The fee for the wrestler does not exist today.
So the subsection 2 of 43-4B-20.5B2 is a new fee. For 2 and 3. Do y'all have a proposed solution before we solve it? Yes, Representative Cole.
If it's a blanket coverage of $100, right? Correct. So I don't see any need for subsection 1, 2, or 3. You could just make it a blanket $100 fee, no matter the amount of wrestlers. Is that correct?
That's right.
Or the number of wrestlers in your stall, or whatever they call it.
Okay, Jill, can you?
Probably.
Starting on line 20 would be at the new sentence, the application shall be accompanied by a non-refundable fee of $100. Period.
Sounds good to me.
And strike all the way down to line 31.
Is that? Is there any objection to that amendment? No objection. That amendment will be adopted, and then that will delete subsections 1, 2, and 3. Right, Jill? How about D? Subsection D. Okay.
That's a new fee. That's a totally new fee.
So how about if we just strike on end of 27, beginning with the word such, and then continue striking on line 28?
How does that apply to Representative Lunsford and to the chair? The statement of a new fee compared to a current fee that was increased. What is the procedure for installing new fees? Is there one? Or?
Current, I think it's the chair's view that increasing current fees or creating new fees, either situation would run us afoul of what we've had to deal with over the past couple of days.
And we concur with your.
Okay. All right, Jill, is that you know of a better way to do that one?
Just strike the sentence.
Yeah. Okay. Is there objection to that? Hearing none, that amendment is adopted. Did that get us through the Franklin amendments. Okay, that gets us down then to Representative Levitas wanted to offer an amendment.
He's over here busy typing, Mr. Chairman.
Did we interrupt you?
Trying to multitask. Just my light's not lit. I don't know if that's intentional out, but I'll keep going. Mr. Chairman, I would move that on line 23 on page 31 that the words misleading through fraudulent be stricken, and in lieu thereof insert the word false.
So that it would read a person who knowingly and intentionally makes a false statement.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
All right, we have a second on the Levitas amendment. Does everyone understand the Levitas amendment?
Could I add to that?
Sure.
We're working off page 31, right? What line?
23.
No, 29. Oh, yes, 20. Yes, sir. 23.
After documentation, could we insert pertaining to the medical history of any performer or, and then go back with any application?
As a member of the committee, are you offering that as an amendment?
Yes, sir.
Is there a second to the Cole amendment?
I'm confused. Somebody read the thing as amended. I thought I understood Mr. Levitas to insert the word false and delete misleading, deceptive, untrue, or fraudulent.
That's correct.
Do I need to make mine separate?
Make it as a substitute.
What's the basis of yours?
We just
Yeah, there as part of the documentation process and the pre and post event reports, there are some questions pertaining to the medical histories, including whether or not somebody has a communicable disease and things of that nature. If we're going to have language to say you can't file false statements on your application for an event, I think in the interest of the safety of the performers and the public, making it so that on the medical documentation you can't make a false statement as well kind of makes it a little bit more clear.
Well, if we do false, if we do what the proposal of Representative Levitas, I mean, that would seem to me to take care of that problem, would it not?
I think it does.
Okay.
My question would be, it says on the any application, which would be your application for a promotion and things like that. There could be an interpretation where the documentation regarding the medical issues of a performer may be outside of that application, but that would be.
Well, the chair's view is that to simply add to adopt the Levitas amendment would take care of that problem. So,
and I withdraw mine.
Okay, thank you, Representative Cole. Was that all of your amendment, Representative Levitas?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Representative Abrams, you have some discussion on the Levitas amendment? You never have to be silent. Maybe she's trying to lead you by example, Representative Levitas. Is there objection to the Levitas amendment? Hearing none, I'm sorry.
I'd just like it restated so I understand it.
Okay. As I understand it, we're on page 31, line 23. We would strike after makes a, strike misleading, deceptive, untrue, or fraudulent, and simply insert the word false.
I would have an amendment to the amendment.
You want to do a separate amendment?
I can.
State what your amendment would be.
After the word on line 24, after the word of, insert the words a material fact. Strike the words on any documentation, put in any application.
Is it possible to restate my amendment to incorporate that? I would have no objection to that.
Suits me.
All right. Is there any objection to the Levitas amendment? Hearing none, it is adopted. Now let's take up the Mumford amendment separately, and it would be on the next line down. And as I understand it, after or false statement of a material fact on any application.
It would say, after accepting the Levitas amendment, I think it would read, any person who knowingly and intentionally makes a false statement of a material fact in any application for a license issued under code section shall be guilty of a misdemeanor.
Okay. Is there any objection to that amendment? Hearing none, it's adopted. Was that the only one you had? Okay. Representative Lunsford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 17, line 29, we have the parentheses B and then the closed parentheses, and I'd like to insert in there, just as an abundance of caution, so that we don't get an over-aggressive commissioner that says, hey, buddy, you're not boxing tonight or you're not wrestling tonight, and I have the exclusive jurisdiction. I'd like to just put in the word, just kind of a bootstrap protection, as except as provided in Code Section 43-4B-19, and then continue that sentence, the Commissioner shall have exclusive jurisdiction. So that what we've done is we haven't given exclusive jurisdiction to the Commissioner other than what he already has under his administrative law portion, so that we always still have a method of appeal, and just to preserve the method of appeal in case someone feels they were done wrong.
Okay. Restate that amendment if you would.
Yes, sir, and I won't take all credit for it. Jill wrote it for me. On 29,
we knew somebody had.
Absolutely, sir. I'm good at finding stuff. I'm not real good at fixing it. On line 29, the beginning of the sentence, start the sentence with, except as provided in CS 43-4B-19, the Commission shall have exclusive jurisdiction to issue, withhold, and then continue on with the rest of the paragraph, sir. Because I think it was their intent for that to fall, administrative law practices to fall throughout. But I firmly believe that there's a hole in the legislation right here, and they don't completely fall under that law practice.
Okay. Is there any question about the Lunsford amendment? Any question? Is there objection? No objection from the author. That amendment will be adopted, there being no objection from the committee. Do you have another one?
No, sir. I'm done.
Vice Chairman Mumford.
Yes, sir.
You asked to be placed on the list for consideration for an amendment.
We've already handled my amendment. I do have a motion to pass. I think we already made that.
We already made that.
I'd ask that the previous question be moved by committee sub as amended.
We there was one other amendment, and the chair will offer it. This was part of the discussions that we had trying to resolve some things prior. And if I would call your attention on page 30. The chair would point out that subsection H, lines 11 and 12, needs to be deleted because that is covered elsewhere in the code. Is there any objection to that amendment? Any objection? Hearing none, that amendment will be adopted. Further amendments. Further amendments. Okay, we have a motion that Senate Bill 413 be given a due pass recommendation by committee sub as amended. Is that right? I'm sorry, you got one thing?
If you wouldn't mind, I just want to be 100% clear on this amendment on page 17, lines 15 and 16. The commission, it says the commission shall set fees as follows, and both of those are supposed to be $250. Is that correct? And so can I make that into a sentence rather than dividing it out into 1 and 2? And
What page again?
page 17. So the commissioner shall set fees, and I'm not sure what the fees are for, but
It's for promoter, matchmaker, or any license. I think if you wanted to.
is that yeah? Not just
Excuse me? Oh.
I'd rather have two.
I'm sorry?
I would prefer if we kept it the way it currently reads.
Okay.
In respect, I think it'll help with any other license part.
I just want to be sure they were both $250, and it's been stated as one sentence.
Okay.
So I was wondering if I could make it one, but I'll leave it two.
Okay. All right. Any further discussion? Any further discussion? Any further amendments? Last call. Senate Rules is about to meet in case anyone's interested other than the chair. All in favor of the motion to give Senate Bill 413 a due pass recommendation by committee sub as amended, please indicate by raising your right hands. All opposed, same indication. The motion has been adopted and will be reported to the Rules Committee accordingly. Do not forget we have our committee photograph on Wednesday at a time when I can round everyone up on the floor. Now, Representative Randall, we have changed the day to accommodate you. Look good as always. Representative Bearden has a request. Thank you all for being here. Meeting's adjourned.
Y'all got all the changes, everything? Yeah.